Excited to welcome you to our athlete briefing here for the Team Wilpers Winter Run Challenge. I hope everyone is having an amazing week 3. Speaking of week 3, we're going to start with a quick review. So naturally, we had those anaerobic capacity intervals working on that high end capacity. Moved on to what was a pretty hard hill interval workout, working on building some real power and efficiency there. Of course, finishing the week with probably what's to come, a nice, easy aerobic training session, AKA our weekly long run here. So a reminder, of course, as we're coming kind of into the halfway part of this challenge here, to make sure you keep going into that portal, checking the box, chasing that 100% completion percentage. It is the best way to set yourself up for success at the end of our 8-week challenge here. Now let's jump into our week 4 workout. So let's talk about the objectives of this week, because it looks a little bit different, right, from some of the previous weeks here. So in training, we're always trying to create adaptations, and we do that by applying a particular training stress or a training load. And so that part of the process is called our loading process, where we're applying those stressors. But part of the training process is also the unloading process. And in the unloading process, we're looking to reduce volume, we're looking to reduce intensity, and we're going to remove a little bit of that stress. And our hopes there is that your body is able to recover from the previous 3 weeks here, continue training aerobically, which is our big, important energy zone anyway. And maybe most importantly is set the stage for the next loading cycle, which for us is going to be the back 4 weeks of this challenge here. It's certainly going to be a higher stress level than the first 3 weeks of this challenge as we come to the conclusion. So really take this one seriously because you want to be rested, ready, and primed to perform over the back 4 weeks here. So I always like to say when I have athletes that are really nailing training, they actually look at these weeks like a real reward, that they put in all the good work to maximize their training and their loading cycle. And now this is a treat that they get to kind of pull back, get some rest before we hit it hard again. So hopefully you'll kind of look at it the same. And if not, it might be worth turning your paces up over the back half of the challenge. So I'm going to jump right into some questions that came up from the group this week. So we'll start with the first question here, which is something I see a lot, especially in cold weather running, because it is about cold weather running and heart rate. So question was, I've learned to not be obsessed with my heart rate when running. However, can we please discuss heart rate when running in colder temps? I'm running at the low end of my easy pace and even slower than that on some days, and my heart rate is just through the roof on easy and long runs. Last weekend, I basically ran 8 miles at threshold according to heart rate. My body felt okay during the run, but I did feel depleted afterwards. I'm not unsure how to keep my heart rate, or let me rephrase, I'm just unsure how to keep my RPE comfortable and still be running at the appropriate heart rate zones. I basically have to walk to stay in zones 2 or 3. So incredibly common issue. I think it's very much worth discussing at this point in time here. Because what in essence happens is probably nothing at all wrong with your heart rate. If all of a sudden you had a good heart rate in warmer weather and now you're getting back out in colder weather and you're seeing these kind of elevated rates, you didn't lose fitness, you didn't all of a sudden, kind of have a higher heart rate or higher max heart rate that happened. But what we see all the time is there's actually an issue with the air and heart rate sensors. So here in winter, we're usually looking at colder, drier air. And that dry air is a problem with the heart rate sensors because the heart rate sensor depends upon moisture to get an accurate reading. So there are definitely things you can do to try to make it a little bit better, especially if you're really interested in your HR data here. Certainly, I am not a huge fan of wrist-based heart rate sensors in general. I don't think they're very accurate. When you look at the data on them, when you look at the science on them, it's pretty supportive of that. So you could certainly utilize an arm strap or a chest strap, something that is also under layers of clothing, so will be a little bit more moist during your session. Even in colder weather, you should continue to get more accurate readings throughout the year, but in particular in comparison to wrist space at this time of the season. In addition, if for some reason you're still getting off readings, you can actually purchase an electrode gel. So this would be similar to what they kind of use in hospitals to set electrodes. It's an artificial moisture that kind of remains for longer than water would. It's going to kind of keep that connection between the electrode of the heart rate sensor and your chest. So it's not very expensive. It's something you can buy on Amazon quite easily. But if for some reason you really want better readings and you're not getting it, I would look into that because it's not a bad way to improve the accuracy there. And then I think probably the final thing, and maybe the best piece of advice I could give on this topic, is just not to worry about it. Is especially on those long runs, on those easy runs, to focus on a nice, easy effort. So I think if you're out and you feel easy and you're conversational and enjoying the day and breathing well, then I'm not too worried about what the exact HR measurement is for that workout. You're doing just fine. So many times I like to get athletes out of their head, and sometimes it's a self-fulfilling prophecy where if you're worried about heart rate and you see the number spiking, you're gonna have a poor visceral reaction and end up not enjoying your run in the same way. So I would encourage you to go the opposite direction, almost like turn the watch off, ignore your pace, ignore your heart rate, focus on a nice, easy effort, and I bet you're gonna have a better session. So let's jump into our next question here. And I thought this was another good one and a really interesting one to kind of talk about, especially this time of year. A lot of race signups are open. And the question was, can you talk about how many races you should do over the course of 6 months and what you should be doing in between those races? So I thought that's a very interesting question. As we start to push towards spring, starting to have a lot of conversation with athletes about what their spring calendar is like, what their summer calendar is like, and those sign-up times are right around now. So ultimately, there's no right or wrong answer here. It just depends how you structure your season. And what I think is very important, however, is that you utilize your races to ultimately support your main goal. So I refer to that main goal usually as an A race. So you want to utilize the other kind of races along the way to make sure that you're supportive of that. So I'm going to talk about an example here of someone doing it poorly, and that someone was me in 2024. So I theoretically wanted to prioritize my marathons in the year, my fall marathons in particular. However, I have a hard time saying no. I'm subject to peer pressure, so I ended up adding a 70.3 triathlon and then an ultra marathon out on the West Coast around Mount Hood. And those sessions in my mind at that time was like, well, this will be a great endurance prep to get me ready for this marathon where I will need much endurance. And it's not entirely wrong, but what in essence ended up happening is those races were too big. I had to go through a taper period. I had to, do the race, and then I had to go through a recovery period. So each time I was showing up to do those events, I was losing 2-3 weeks of training time to taper and recover and get back into training again. So it ultimately was not supportive of that A race. So the smarter thing to have done would have been to look at my big goal of the year and say, like, what are the races that are now supportive of that? So 5Ks would have been great. 10Ks would have been great. Half marathons, if well placed, can be great in helping prepare for that event there. So also worth keeping in mind that the shorter the race, the more opportunity to race more often. So thinking about the marathon, most people can really only peak 1 time per year for that race. Some might argue 2. I'm going to say 1. So for a conversation. Half marathoners, maybe 2-3 times a year, possibly 4, depending on how you're going, but really probably only peaking twice. 10Ks, on the other hand, you can really run every few weeks. So you're not going to be peaked maximally for every time, but the recovery demands aren't so stringent that you can't run them fairly often and build a season out of 10Ks. And 5Ks and shorter, you could really get down, you could almost run that race every week. Similarly, you might not be peaked for every single race. As a matter of fact, you won't be. But the recovery demands are not so stringent that you can't do it as part of a workout, recover, and do it again a week later. So something to keep in mind as you're building your calendar. So in essence, to back it up, when I think about season planning here, what I start with is I lay out my A races. So that's not going to be very many, right? Over the course of a whole year, And maybe I'm talking about between 2 and 4 races I think are really kind of my A races of the year. Then I'll kind of go to my second step, which is I want to layer in the B races. The B races are things that I think are going to be supportive of that A race. So let's use the half marathon as an example. Early in the training cycle for a half marathon, 5Ks might be a really good race to kind of get tuned up, to kind of see what my pace is like, get in a race environment and kind of test things out. So I get a little bit deeper towards the half marathon. 5K is going to be decent, but it's not going to be the best race. Really, I would say a 10K at that point is a great race to get out, sort of see how things are going. You're like really using similar energy zones to the half marathon, just a little bit faster. So the goal, if like well utilized, is you go out and run a hard 10K. When you get to that half marathon, you actually get to ease off the pace a little bit, which is not a bad feeling to have at the start of your main race there. So I lay out those B races. And then finally, I think there's always got to be time for this also. I'll put in some C races. And C races are ones where I have no performance goals whatsoever. I might be interested in going out and running the race for fun with a friend, to pace someone else, etc. So those are things that I will ultimately turn into a workout, make as part of my long run, etc. It just is not something that I'm going to take any time out of my training schedule. It's certainly not something I'm going to go after and race very hard there. So I will encourage athletes that I work with to, I kind of phrase it as I want you racing early and often as much as possible. And why that is I just think there's a big skill to be learned in running races. It's not something you just naturally know how to do. You don't know how to push at which point and hold back in one point, all the way down to you don't know naturally what it's like to have to wake up the crack of dawn, work through a big crowd, take on the stress of race morning. These are things that you learn from experience and you build that muscle of racing. So whether it's an A, a B, or a C, every time you're just kind of sharpening the knife a little bit so that when you're ready to get to your A race, you know exactly what to do on that day. So once sharing personal stories today, I think here in the top half, the first 6 months of 2025, I already have signed up for roughly 15 races. So it's a lot for me in comparison to some previous years, but I'm really only I have about 2 A races out of that I'm kind of focused on, want to, really look into performance. I have quite a few B races that I plan to use as workouts, tune-ups, test things that I think are going to be supportive of those A races. Then I have quite a few as well of, I'll call this C race buckets. These are my fun runs and things that I'm just going out to participate in for the joy of running. So like I said, there's a time and a spot for those. They're part of the plan, but certainly not pulling any focus from my running schedule. So hopefully that was helpful in terms of kind of the cadence of racing. As I said, there's no right or wrong way to do it. You just want to make sure when you're kind of creating your plan that the races along the way are ultimately supporting you and not pulling back and hindering you from going after that A goal. Otherwise, that'll be all here for our athlete briefing this week. Thanks as always for tuning in. Can't wait to see you next time.